Good evening, everyone. My name is Joanna Chismash. I'm a professor at York Law School and the co-director of the Center for Applied Human Rights. I'm also the principal investigator of the research consortium that is hosting this event today. This is the Beyond Compliance Consortium, building evidence on promoting restraint by armed actors. We're funded with UK international development by the UK government. This program is a co-productive socio-legal partnership that brings together 3 universities with 6 humanitarian and human rights organizations. And I'd like to start by thanking ODI tonight for lending us this amazing venue, and thanking you all, those in person and those online, for joining us this evening. So January, if you're like me, you take some time for reflection. And it's an important moment to take stock of the year that has just finished, to look forward into the new year, to consider how it will be different and what we will see, what we should expect, and what we should maybe do. So I think many of us here today will share the view that 2024 was horrible when it comes to armed conflict. The ICRC's latest count was that we're seeing 120 armed conflicts raging across the globe. And this is a sobering number. But then when you look at the micro figures, that's even more terrible. I'm setting the scene nicely by depressing everyone, clearly, but yeah, this is the reality. The UN's Protection of Civilians in Armed Conflict report, which was published in May last year, found that there had been a 72 increase of civilians killed in 2023 compared to 2022. Now, I'm quite sure that 2024, the figures are going to be even more staggering. But what I'm saying here is a discourse and a frame that we very often use, which is we think of conflict in terms of casualties, in terms of physical destruction of property. And in a sense, this is an instrumentalist approach, not a humanist approach. Instrumentalist because we can easier count death and destruction. However, the everyday lived experiences of local communities in Ukraine, in Sudan, in South Sudan, the DRC, Myanmar, Israel, Palestine, and so many other places, include, in addition to killings and displacement, also starvation, disease, missed educational opportunities, shattered livelihoods, grief, and something that it's so difficult to quantify, but so true and real, hopelessness. Around the globe, therefore, millions of individuals are navigating these conflicts that sometimes last for decades. And within these conflicts, differently situated groups experience harm and need compounded very often. So against this backdrop, the consortium interdisciplinary work seeks to build evidence on how harm and need are experienced every day in armed conflict, but it also seeks to investigate the fuller toolbox of strategies to prevent, mitigate, and respond to harm and need. Our project understands that international law, and by that I mean international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and possible other branches relevant to armed conflict, are fundamental tools to alleviate harm and need, but it also seeks to understand and recognize their limits. This explains why the consortium is looking beyond the law, so that the research first centers the lived experiences of people on the ground, the spaces on the ground, the variety of actors on the ground, as looking through the legal lens first. We're concerned that we are missing out lots of experiences, many spaces, and a multitude of actors. Second, then, we investigate what initiatives and strategies to prevent, mitigate, and respond to harm and need lie in the law or with the law, but also beyond the law. I just want to be very clear. We say yes to beyond the law, but not without the law. This is a point that is really important to the consortium. And now I have the wonderful pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, brilliant academic and dear friend, Catherine Fortin from Utrecht University and co-investigator of the Beyond Compliance Consortium.
Thanks so much, Joanna. Well, what a privilege it is to be able to be the one to moderate this discussion with such a stellar interdisciplinary panel, so many distinguished experts from the NGO and policy world, academia and research. I'm not going to provide a detailed bio of all of our speakers, but I am going to introduce you to them so that you know who's in front of you, and I'm going to state their place of work. And you can assume that the speakers are speaking in their personal capacity unless they state otherwise. So I'm going to start at that end first with Andrew Bartle-Smith, independent consultant, formerly with the International Committee of the Red Cross, who has a specific expertise on IHL and religious actors. Then moving on, we have Shelley Whitman, the Executive Director of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. Then, moving on, we have Emiliano Baus, Professor of International Law at the University of Buenos Aires and Chair of International Law and Human Rights at the Central University in Azul. Then we have Gemma Davis, Senior Research Fellow for the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, who's of course hosting this event and lent us this amazing space. Then we have Helen Kinsella, who is Professor of Political Science and Law from the University of Minnesota. So what a lineup. So we've asked our speakers tonight to sort of do a bit of crystal ball gazing and tell us a little bit about the conflict realities that we can expect in 2025. This year, what law, policy and praxis responses can be expected from local, governmental and international actors. We've asked them to think about some of the main challenges that we'll see and some of the main developments that we'll see. So I'm going to go just to give you, I think we'll just go in the order that we've got here. So I'm going to start.
Oh, thanks.
No, I'll start with you, Shelley, because you were originally going to go first, and then we'll move to Andrew. Yeah. You thought you got away with it, but no, we'll start with Shelley just to keep it as it was. So I've had the privilege of being able to think of a question for these speakers, which I'm going to ask them. And then what we'll do when we get the answers is we'll be putting a whole load of issues on the table. So they've all got a varied expertise. I'm going to ask a whole load of varied questions. We're going to have a whole lot of issues on the table. And that's when we'll open it up to the audience and you can pick up on any of these issues that you find interesting and ask about them. Okay. So Shelley, in your position at the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, I know that you're working across the globe on a whole range of issues relating to children, armed conflict and peacekeeping. And I know that you could speak tonight on many of them and many issues and many contexts. So to keep it simple, I would just like to focus on two. I'm going to ask you about two. So the first context I'd like to ask you about is South Sudan. And the second is the DRC, because I know that you've been working on both of these issues recently. So I wondered if you could share with us some of the main issues that you see to be on the table when thinking about children in armed conflict in these contexts. And maybe then also, if we're thinking about the security sector, whether they're peacekeepers or national actors, and we're thinking about how these actors should be addressing violations against children, what are the main challenges and what developments might we see in 2025? So I've sort of asked three, all wrapped up in one.
Okay.
See what you can do.
And 7 minutes, right? I'm going to try my very best. You're lucky you have me and not General Dallaire. So thank you for the opportunity, first of all, to be here. And I just wanted to maybe also give a little bit of context that for the Dallaire Institute, when we work on issues around the globe, we're trying to look at how children should be at the heart of peace and security efforts, right? And so that means in terms of not only their protection, but as part of the solution to the issues around the globe. And so for us, we do work with the security sector on that approach, as well as a community engagement approach. And we hope that by combining these approaches, we might also create spaces for innovative solutions and dialogue as well. So talking about the DRC and about South Sudan, two very complex conflicts who anyone that follows them understands that you need to be able to understand the comprehensive regional players, and both of those conflicts also affect one another. You also can't understand those without understanding what's happening in the Great Lakes region as a whole, or in Sudan at the top, or what's going on in Ethiopia, and to understand that each is complex and have international influences as well. But in both of these countries, you have UN peacekeeping operations, you have peace agreements, and you also have significant records of violations against children through at least the most recent history. And so if we look at some of these issues, globally, we have a challenge in that there's been a lot of undermining of the UN as a body over this last year. And certainly major UN Security Council powers are doing their best to continue to undermine the United Nations. And that kind of inward-looking approach of governments will be exacerbated by things such as the Trump administration and increasingly other changes in regimes, right? So that will have an impact because peacekeeping is going to keep reducing in the DRC. The peacekeeping mission is to end, right? And yet at the same time, we're seeing right now violations increasing in the East. As we speak, there are violations happening against children that are increasing on a daily basis, and some pretty horrific violations that are taking place. I would also want to argue that this is also where regional agreements and regional bodies are going to have to step up. And if we're going to look at something that is going to increasingly happen into this year, bilateral and regional arrangements are going to have to increasingly be understood. And in some cases that will be beneficial. In some cases, it's going to be of a detriment as well. So to follow on from this a little bit, I want to think about, on the one hand, there hasn't been enough done at a national level to strengthen the security sector reform for both of these countries. And so we need to continue to increase that. And when we say increase security sector reform, I want to just be clear that there are some efforts that have taken place, but they haven't been consistent or sustained, because generally those parties that I'm telling you that are influencing from the outside don't really want that stability to occur at a national level as well. So we have to think a little bit about that, and the pulling back of peacekeeping troops in the DRC as an example will also be something to consider in terms of those spaces that are being vacated and who's going to take over those spaces, right? And that should mean that we need to really think about that security sector reform aspect a lot, but also what it means in terms of children. The lack of progress on the peace agreements in both countries is also something to be concerned about as well. And we should not hold back on the need to continue to work on improving child protection and seeing this as a critical piece to those peace agreements. I don't think it's used enough as an important area that we should get agreement on when we're looking at peace negotiations. As someone who personally was involved in the inter-Congolese dialogue and the peace process long before my role with the Dallaire Institute, And now we are also doing some efforts in South Sudan with the Tumani peace process, also trying to infuse language and approaches related to children into those processes. There aren't enough peace mediators who understand the criticality of this being a central part of the discussions and the agreements. Right, so very quickly in terms of quick snapshots on the DRC, so we've already seen escalating violence in the eastern part, more than 100,000 displaced, more than half are women and children. We also see that while the FARDC has made a lot of progress in terms of preventing recruitment and use of children within their own ranks, they are facing multiple armed groups who are using children. And that will be an increasing problem for them to have to cope with and deal with as well. We also know that the situation related to things like coltan and mineral use and things like electric vehicles being promoted, et cetera, is increasing the grave challenges in those areas where children are also vulnerable. And of course, you know, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to the situation between the DRC and Rwanda. And the kind of approaches on the peace process will have an impact, right, on access to humanitarian goods and needs, et cetera. Right, very quickly, if I move to South Sudan, well, in South Sudan, it's directly being impacted by the conflict in Sudan. Certainly the recent violence where there have been South Sudanese who've been attacked and killed has caused increasing resentment as well across the border. But, you know, what happens in Sudan will always have a fall down, trickle down effect in terms of South Sudan. So it faces economic collapse, political instability, worsening food insecurity, climate shocks. And this past year in 2024, the South Sudanese themselves took it upon themselves to also look from a whole of government approach about why there's been increasing recruitment and use of children in the country. So that was a major conference in 2024 that they started to look at. Previously, the numbers had been going down over the previous 3 to 5 years, but now they're starting to see a resurgence. Not inconsequential that that's happening at the same time that there was a delay in the elections and the current peace process is to be ending in February of this year, and a lot of uncertainty about what's going to come forward over the next year. So we have to think about all of that. And also from a children's perspective, I want to just highlight that I know we focus a lot in terms of thinking of internationally the impacts of the conflict, but internally there's a lot of gang violence happening in Juba as an example, and the trafficking issues related to children as a result of Sudan is also having an impact at a domestic level. So there's a lot of severe constraints there, and a lot of constraints when it comes to thinking about the peace process. And I would just maybe like sum up here at the end that, you know, I really think that the splintering of groups and new alliances is a factor that will continue to impact recruitment and use of children and exacerbate the conflicts. We have to think about how we're going to address some of these issues, and the global resource wars and the escalation due to things like the mineral competition and oil aspects will continue to have impacts, as well as kind of global disregard for international humanitarian law that's been on display for the world to see. Even though there may be conflicts in other parts of the world, we have to look at like the way that we have been responding to these violations is something that those particular groups that we're dealing with in countries like South Sudan and DRC are also well aware of. And so it has a ripple effect in that way. Okay.
Amazing. Yeah, no, but that's a great start. You've put lots of issues on the table. I think some of them are also going to be picked up by other speakers. So that's just a great beginning. And it takes me nicely to now Andrew, who's at the other end, because you ended by talking about the global disregard for IHL, and thereby introducing the topic of compliance, and thereby also, I think, engagement with armed actors. So Andrew, I'd like to ask you about one aspect of engagement. So, of course, we're not only looking at the present in this panel, but we're also looking forward into the future. And I want to ask you about your area of expertise, which is really the religious dimension. So the religious dimension of contemporary challenges, particularly when it comes to the engagement with religious actors. And I'm guessing, and I won't say religious actors or armed actors, but I'm actually thinking that the two might be one and the same. So, so then on issues such as religion, international humanitarian law, harm and needs more broadly. And I think asking you that question is going to take us to a completely different area of the world, because your focus is on Asia. So feel free to focus on that in your answer.
Thank you. I mean, religion is certainly not going away. It's resurgent, and it's a central aspect or component of conflicts around the world. But I'm often surprised how it's not really taken on board by humanitarian actors to a sufficient extent. Religious leaders, resources, and often not properly engaged, and we miss opportunities to have a positive humanitarian impact. So this is basically where I'm coming from. In the absence of a strong enforcement regime, conventional humanitarian responses, often center on fostering compliance with international humanitarian law and, where relevant, international human rights law. But while IHL makes a central contribution towards the regulation of armed conflict, the protections it provides are not comprehensive. This is particularly evident with regard to collateral killing, whereby belligerents can inflict severe harm on civilian populations while claiming to be in compliance with the law. IHL protections are furthermore eroded by state and non-state actors who violate the law with impunity or interpret it permissively to expand rather than limit their scope for violence. So in the light of these challenges, realization is growing that an exclusive focus on the law is insufficient, and that extra legal resources must be mobilized, both to improve compliance with IHL and to promote a broader culture of restraint in order to reduce harm. Furthermore, some of the physical and psychological harms caused by armed conflict and the needs that they generate are not fully addressed by IHL, and it's necessary to explore alternative frames of reference to account for them, as this is the purpose of the project. And this can facilitate the development of solutions that prioritize the mitigation of harm and need as much as compliance with the law. So part of the solution, also, given these limitations, involves empowering communities to protect and sustain themselves where possible, so as not to over-rely on international institutions that overpromise and underdeliver. But it's also important to look to other actors and resources that can help. So I'm obviously going to focus on religious circles. This is particularly interesting when we focus on non-Western traditions that can challenge perhaps some of the humanitarian biases we might have, and to challenge dominant conceptions, Western conceptions of humanitarian action. So, the president of the ICRC recently appealed, for belligerents to uphold the spirit as well as the letter of the law. And so what is this spirit, this intangible spirit? It's certainly an acknowledgement that IHL, the law, needs to be animated by something more. I don't think the law is served by a positivist focus, to the exclusion of extra legal resources that might complement and support it. So this spirit presumably has an ethical, psychological, or spiritual component that taps into the identities, emotions, and morality of belligerents, and therefore to their core motivations. And indeed, ethics and moral judgment are essential, in order to apply IHL. The law doesn't work on its own. The principle of proportionality, for example, requires subjective assessment, some kind of moral compass. So consideration should be given to the religious and philosophical traditions which have contributed to socializing belligerents in diverse cultures, and from which the rules and ethics of war and ultimately IHL have emerged. Research has shown that moral and religious resources are powerful vectors for influencing the behavior of belligerents. So IHL needs to be in dialogue with them if it's to remain relevant in many contexts. And this concerns the inner life of combatants. It promotes internalization of good conduct. A lot of focus on intention. For Aquinas, this was central. as it is in Buddhist ethics, for example, and many other religious and philosophical traditions. Yeah, so and these are sometimes neglected, when we're promoting the law and engaging with various actors. In the absence of reliable enforcement mechanisms, of course, intention has an even greater bearing on the implementation of IHL rules. And religious and spiritual resources are also very powerful coping mechanisms for those caught up in armed conflict, contributing to bolstering their physical and psychological resilience. A lot of work progress has been made in engaging with religious circles, engaging with various religious traditions, often to find correspondences with IHL. And if you find a religion that doesn't exactly agree with IHL, then we don't want to engage. I mean, this is completely the wrong approach, of course. We need to embrace difference. We need to embrace debate. That's where minds are changed. That's where the magic happens, and this reluctance to engage, to get a little bit messy, is holding humanitarian action back. So diverse religious and philosophical resources provide fresh insights and perspectives on the conduct of armed conflict. They contribute to more holistic and culturally adapted approaches that can mitigate the suffering that's caused. And this learning curve is likely to be steeper if we embrace traditions, for example, non-Abrahamic traditions. I mean, IHL is largely derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and so if we look to Buddhist principles, for example, these are radically different, and we can learn more. They're more challenging, and they can really sort of help to address the biases and assumptions that we might have. Having said all of this about having to engage with faith-based actors, let's not forget that faith-based actors are at the very origin, and perhaps they are the future of humanitarian action. That they're still innovating all over the world. The ICRC, which I used to work for, was founded by religious entrepreneurs, and so in Asia, where I'm based, faith-based actors are they're at the very forefront. Then increasingly see the sort of the traditional the traditional actors, humanitarian actors, as perhaps becoming increasingly irrelevant. So despite all of this, there is surprisingly still a reluctance to engage with religious circles. Religion obviously is often seen as more of a problem and a solution to armed conflict, because of course religion also has a lot to do with why people fight and how. So but again, the answer to this is engagement, not retreat, if we want to sort of address these issues. So many I'm still surprised many humanitarian and academic reports continue to underplay the religious dimension. There's still this sort of secular bias, almost sometimes an anti-religious bias, which is also in the social sciences and academia as well. And this is weird because some organizations, humanitarian organizations, they themselves behave like religions or sects. They seem to have a peculiar lack of self-awareness. I've myself been accused of heresy, on a number of occasions. So so this is rather strange. It's also strange because of the origins of IHL and religious principles, etc. So, humanitarians have been reluctant to engage, but they must. And it's all about engaging with the context. Increasing ideas of neutrality and impartiality can mean that we sort of stand aloof. But a humanitarian mandate doesn't give us a pass to sort of ignore the culture. And professionalization of the humanitarian sector doesn't help if it doesn't help us to engage with the context, which I think is one of the main challenges we face. So there's a very narrow bandwidth of engagement. Maybe I'll move on a little bit quickly. Obviously, IHL has its limitations. Amongst these, of course, is that in this multilateral world now, this consensus is fragmenting. State and non-state actors are looking to their own traditions, cultures, religions, and we increasingly need to engage with these intersecting moral systems and universes. We can't just assume that there's one solution. So there needs to be dialogue at various levels, also at local level. And this post-World War II consensus, with the relative decline of American power, institutions that have been parasitic on American power are going, they're going to face challenges. They're going to have to reach out. Also, I mean, IHL embodies universal principles, but it at the same time it comes from, it's a Western framework, and so it needs to be challenged. There needs to be a debate about this if it's going to be accepted in other cultures. And the law, of course, depends on consensus, and where it's weak or fragmented, then we're not going to get anywhere. So we need to build a new consensus. Maybe we can't build it at the center. Maybe we need to build it in different contexts, in different ways, interacting with different religions and cultures. But I think that increasingly it's going to be a more fragmented picture. So I mean, and I think if engaging with religious circles has been a very positive experience for our teams. Religious circles are highly networked. They're very effective communicators, often much more effective than humanitarian actors. Religion is, is a form of popular culture, which is accessible to many people. There are extensive networks present in every village, in conflict affected areas. Often it's the religious networks that survive, of course, religious networks have many different dimensions. They're involved in community, grassroots work. They're involved in education. So these are fora where we can introduce IHL, talk about humanitarian principles. They're involved in proselytizing. They're involved in humanitarian work. They invented it, I would argue. They're peace building. They're involved in politics. They make, armed groups, business. Religious people are more. I mean, there's some studies have been carried out to sort of suggest that religious people are more generous. So again, humanitarian organizations would do well to approach them for support. So there are all these different dimensions that are covered, and religion has so many different, it has so many different resources, such as the law, ethics, values, art, science, various training tools, meditation techniques. There's so much that it can offer, but these resources are often not being tapped into by humanitarian actors. And IHL is a very powerful tool in this respect. I'm not putting IHL down. It embodies an unusual degree of cross-cultural consensus, embodying something close to universal norms, or resonating with our moral psychology. So it's a very powerful tool, but it's just not being used to its full extent. And religious leaders can help us to do this.
Andrew, if you can,
and I'll wrap up now. That's it, basically.
Amazing.
Yeah, but so basically, yeah. I mean, I think religions, I think they played a major part in creating, the religious charities creating the humanitarian sector. They're the past, and I think they're also very much the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks also for putting some hard kind of opinions on the table about, the way you think that conversations need to go and be held, and what you think there needs to be more of. So I appreciate that, because I think it's good to have some points for discussion. Maybe some of those points will be picked up in the discussion. We've heard now from Shelley and Andrew that context really matters. So I think if I can extract from your two presentations, we're talking about context in terms of the political context, the historical context, the legal context, and Andrew then really the religious context. And I think this is also something that we're going to hear more about from Gemma. But before we go to Gemma, I'd like to move to a different context where I think also we're going to see a similar dynamic. And here I'd like to turn to you, Emiliano. So I wanted to ask you if you could share some of your insights from your work in Colombia. And in particular, I know that you've been involved in working on the special jurisdiction for peace, which has been faced with a number of really hard and crucial legal questions that have arisen out of that context, relating to the armed conflict there, and also accountability questions. So, for example, the notion of environmental harm and needs, one, and another one, the idea of what is a victim in IHL and ICL. So again, here I can imagine that also context matters. I wondered if you could share some insights on your work on those issues, and then pulling out your crystal ball again, if you could have a look into 2025 and tell us what you think we'll be seeing on those issues.
Okay. So thank you, Catherine, for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers. So basically, I have been working from the University of Buenos Aires. We have an observatory on IHL. So one of the projects we have deals with Colombia. And in order to understand a little about the future of Colombia, we have to bear in mind that Colombia is dealing now with past violence and present violence. And this is a challenge in multiple levels. I will focus basically now in one of these, I think, stakeholders which we have been working with, which is basically the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. I don't know how much aware you are of what the HEP is doing actually, but the HEP is a very unique institution on a variety of reasons. You know that it was designed to investigate, to prosecute, and to punish those who are responsible for the most serious violations of IHL and human rights law committed during the internal armed conflict, an internal armed conflict that lasted for more than five decades. It is the result of a peace negotiation, and in order to understand a little how it deals with legal and extra-legal considerations, we should not forget this. And it's the justice component of a transitional justice mechanism. So from that point of view, and I think analyzing what the HEP is doing and what the HEP will do is key in order to understand what lays behind the conflict in Colombia. We should bear in mind that these kind of institutions are very particular because they have what I would call a sort of liminal nature. It's a laboratory that stands in the middle of a number of things. And it's liminal on the one side because it has been created at the intersection of interests, the government interest on the one side and the FARC, the non-state armed group, on the other side. So this was the result of a negotiation which embeds the whole HEP with a very strange and particular nature. And also I think it's liminal because it's a very specific way of putting forward justice, which is at the middle of what I would call a dialogical approach, in the sense that the interest of the HEP is to obtain truth and recognize damage to victims. But at the same time, it's introducing an adversarial approach. So it's restorative and it's retributive at the same time. And it fulfills both objectives at the same time. So basically, the HEP is situated, I would say, at a sort of crossroad between multiple thresholds. And the HEP itself is part of this sort of transitional moment that Colombia is living. I have been working basically on international humanitarian law from an affective perspective. So my interest in my work has been trying to incorporate in our legal analysis the way in which emotions play a role among combatants, play a role among the civilian population, play a role among all the stakeholders which are involved. And just maybe to take some inputs from what Andrew said about the problems of religion and the Western conception, I would perhaps show a specific example to portray the challenges which I expect that the HEP is going to continue facing in the years to come. And the case I'm going to basically to quote today has to do with the sentimental link to the protection of the environment, which has been discussed at many times at the HEP. You know that the HEP works with macro cases. Basically, there's huge cases in which several behaviors and conducts are included. And one of those cases, the case number 5, is based upon a territorial situation, which is the situation in Northern Cauca and the Southern Cauca Valley. And one of the interesting aspects of this case is that it has the largest number of victims which are acknowledged. Thousands and thousands of victims that have been identified here. What's interesting in the first indictment, which was produced within the context of this case number 5, which is the territorial situation I was mentioning, is that there was a lot of effort put into the identification of the environment as a victim in itself. A lot of energy, and I'm just quoting one of the paragraphs of the decision, anthropocentric and ecocentric perspectives in the protection of the environment should complement each other and cannot be understood as contradictory. And so here the HEP tried basically to focus on the perspectives and the cosmovisions of the indigenous populations of Cauca and South Cauca. Nature is considered to be an ecosystem. Living creatures like human beings and non-human beings coexist. There is a sacred space, a spiritual character involved in the territory. So basically, the territory should be preserved from harm. The territory is among the victims who suffer. So there's an emotional input basically placed on this idea of the territory. And Pierre, I'm looking at Pierre, has a wonderful blog input on the spiritual harm related basically to the way in which this territory is affected. Harm has vulnerated the harmony and the autonomy of the indigenous populations in these regions. So basically, what the HIP is trying to do is to incorporate this sort of tribal indigenous perspective. Now, the problem is when this becomes a judicial response and when magistrates need to apply the law, and the limits of IHL can be seen here. So the legal lens invisibilizes in the same decision this very perspective. And I'm showing you the way in which this is problematic. When the magistrates of the HEP need to address the harm to the environment, they have to go to IHL, they have to go to conventional IHL and to customary IHL. And there's a problem there because this, of course, is a Western way of conceiving the applicability of a legal system. First problem is that the articles related to the protection of the environment, they are applicable to an international conflict and not to an IAC. First huge problem. Second problem, what sort of war crime shall we include in the indictment? Here's a huge problem. And so the judges in the main opinion, they decided that the correct war crime to be applied is based upon what the Rome Statute says in Article 8(2)(e)(12). This is applicable to NIAC, okay, but it says basically that it will be responsible the person who destroys or seizes the property of an adversary. And there's a huge problem here. There's a huge problem because if we consider that, then the territory becomes again an object. It's an object that you eventually could have as a property, that you could have as something that you own, not taking into consideration the political dimension. Because if the FARC affected the environment and the natural environment, and this environment, in fact, belonged to the government, this, of course, politically means that the indigenous populations have no right to the ancestral ownership of that sort of heritage. So again, this produced a social impact which emotionally produced a sort of contradictory consequence. So there is a tension, and I think that this tension will go on between considering, in this case, the environment as a subject or as an object. And this tension, in fact, is a larger one. And Andrew was mentioning this. It's applying Western, modern, colonial criteria for establishing legal violations, IHL, and on the other side, trying to include indigenous views of justice for whom nature and humans have similar status as part of a global environment. So challenges ahead. I think first, the HEP should explore this sort of liminalities. Either you expand these sort of reflections in order to avoid contradictions, or you start living with contradictions, and of course, bearing in mind that this has consequences. How to be creative without betraying the legal regime which is applicable, how to consider extra legal sources at the same time when you're expected to apply the law. I think that's a challenge that we will see in future decisions of the HEP. And finally, I think that one of the experiences that we can see if we read what the HEP is doing is that we consider that both harm and need are essentially culture-sensitive concepts, that you cannot think of these terms in an abstract manner. These sort of decisions, and this is why I think the judiciary is a stakeholder that we cannot leave aside, has and will have effects on the current forms of violence we're seeing in Colombia. Probably you're all aware of what happened last week in Norte de Santander, this new violence that is coming across. I think that the judiciary might eventually have an impact and an effect on how this violence is going to produce. Why? Because what the HEP is doing is also shaping perceptions of actors in the conflict. And this eventually, and we have to be aware of this, could become in the future a driver of eventually more harm and more need in the time to come. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks. So as my role as moderator, I'm seeing all these themes emerging, which is great. So we've got context matters. Great. We've got also picked up what Andrew said about engagement and the importance of not retreating. And then I think what was coming out, I mean, in Emiliano, lots of things were coming out, but I'm working to Gemma now. What I see coming out that's a link for me between your work and Gemma's work is this notion of subjects and objects and treating civilian communities and recognizing the agency of civilian communities in terms of engagement. So Gemma, you're going to be picking up a number of these themes, I think, because you've just published a very insightful report, which is called Reducing Violence and Strengthening the Protection of Civilians, Debunking Assumptions. And I know that that's a report that's based on quite a few years' work of research. So I wondered if you could just share and reflect a bit about your findings of the report and also your work at ODI more generally, and drawing from those reflections, tell us a little bit, going back to that crystal ball, of what we might be expecting in 2025. And I'm aware that you're the only panelist here from the UK, and this is an event in the UK. So maybe you have the ability to tell us what we can expect from the UK on some of these matters, whatever the UK is.
A very short ask then. Yeah, thank you. And I think one other of the real common themes that's coming out is just that framing protection in relation to IHL is inadequate. It's too narrow. It doesn't account for the full harms that that civilians face in contemporary conflict, and we need a more holistic approach. In line with the full protection of civilians approach that the UN Secretary General referred to and called for last year. So yes, we've, with our few years of research, tried to debunk assumptions, particularly that humanitarian actors take, which are really significant barriers to undermining international action to strengthen civilian protection. And we've set out recommended actions, which I'll speak to today. So first, with humanitarian action in particular, writ large, generally, it acts almost solely on the vulnerability of affected civilians, considering people in crisis as powerless beneficiaries of aid, rather than systematically seeking to reinforce the context-specific agency capacities of communities to reducing the violence that they face. And when seeking to influence behaviours to promote restraint, appealing to local norms, values, customs can be far more effective than drawing on international humanitarian human rights frameworks, which have various degrees of, well, they often not well known, varying degrees of acceptance among communities, armed actors alike, particularly in this current geopolitical context of wild hypocrisy, double standards in the application of IHL and other normative frameworks. So, as other fellow panelists have referred to, we really, really need context-specific approaches at hyper-local levels. But contextualized approaches require difficult dilemmas, hard choices, always compromises, and there can't be pre-designed standardized approaches, which is often where the humanitarian sector falls down. So strengthening community agency and capacities requires humanitarian actors to respect and support community ownership and solutions. Interventions are successful when they start with what communities are already doing, understand what communities are already doing, build out from there with a view to multiplying those civilian-led efforts. Secondly, humanitarian actors in particular fall short of directly engaging in dialogue with those that instigate violence for the purpose of reducing violence, as Andrew also referred to earlier. Some question whether it's their role whether it should be left to mandated actors like the International Committee of the Red Cross. Many who do so for the purpose of negotiating things like access or delivering goods and services rather than promoting protection. And many also perceive that the risks are too high, that engaging perpetrators may somehow compromise the principle of neutrality, or that it might legitimize armed actors, particularly when they're not formally parties to conflict. And others have referred to, gangs, organized criminal groups, etc. But while there might be risks, dismissing dialogue with armed actors without managing those risks is a significant mistake. And when managing those risks, engaging in dialogue with perpetrators of violence can lead to profound results. So we've actually, really said or recommended that consideration should be given to the consequences of not engaging armed actors, and recognizing that reducing levels of violence can only happen if you bring perpetrators and those that have an influence over the use of violence around the table into some form of dialogue. But to facilitate that requires institutions to consider whether they have the necessary risk tolerance to support unpredictable actions, unpredictable actors, and what it would take to increase that if necessary. And often that's also around preconceptions, not only around institutional risk appetite, but also the risk appetite of funders and donors. There also needs to be greater recognition of the interplay between protection and strengthening the safety and security of civilians with peace building, as well as livelihood and development initiatives, particularly when socioeconomic factors are key drivers of violence. Because when violent responses are so entrenched, those that use violence need convincing that non-violent means are in their interest, which requires support for alternatives. So the provision of material support, services, livelihoods, for example, can change the people's calculations by providing an alternative to the economic benefits of the use of violence. We spoke a bit about South Sudan earlier, and we've done quite a lot of work in South Sudan. And in some areas of South Sudan, escalations in violence are very predictable. One humanitarian actor that we came across, working with peace-building partners, with local actors, with civil society, initiated a short-term road-building project, bringing together youths at risk of participating in violence from different ethnicities ahead of planned mobilization of attacks. Not only did that de-escalate violence in the immediate term, but it also enabled previously conflicting youths to interact and start breaking down the negative stereotypes that they had of one another. So going back to the full protection of civilians approach, it's a collective effort. It requires working in complementarity through mutually reinforcing approaches across humanitarian peace-building, development and diplomacy initiatives. However, international actors too often adopt a linear understanding of conflict and violence, which prioritizes humanitarian action as a frontline response, with peace-building action and development action deployed later. But that doesn't reflect at all the reality of violence and conflict, and nor does it acknowledge the capacities, skills prioritized within, for example, peace-building organizations, such as negotiation, mediation, dialogue, which are critical to reduce immediate threats of violence. So there's really a mindset shift that's required in the international sphere, recognizing that peace-building action can and should start early, including in situations of high-intensity violence, requiring that humanitarian actors to consider how they can better use their full toolbox to reduce violence and promote peace, and in turn how peace-building action can more systematically reduce and respond to the immediate risks to the protection of civilians. And there's a responsibility, but far too often a lack of accountability on the state, on development, humanitarian actors, to deliver emergency and longer-term incentives to reduce violence, the so-called peace dividends. And that requires listening to civilian and armed actors' suggestions on their terms and responding on their terms, and without doing so, risks a return to violent responses. But to enable all of this requires political will from donors, policymakers, operational organisations to address long-standing systemic structural and cultural barriers, risk aversion, and the political economy of the aid sector. There's a significant role for donors, such as FCDO, to require that agencies and organizations work in complementarity, to require them to demonstrate how each action that they're taking, when they say this is towards promoting protection, how does each action contribute towards that and towards violence reduction? And importantly, not to incentivize competitive individual agency interests and goals. But ultimately, it requires all institutions and individuals to be clear on the compromises they're willing to take, what they do and what they do not have the will to change, and take the responsibility for the actions and the impact they have. But also, as I said before, to consider the serious risks of not seeking to integrate these approaches on the lives of individuals and communities affected by violence and conflict. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll finish there for now.
I'm sure there'll be more opportunity to say a little bit more during the questions. Helen, last but absolutely not least, I want to ask you, you've written a lot of stuff that I love on gender, race, civilization, international humanitarian law. And I know that you've been lately working on civilian harm. And in particular, you've been working on the US Civilian Harm Mitigation Response Action Plan, something that I learned is called CHIMRAP, to those in the know. So we had Trump's inauguration yesterday, and the world is watching and waiting. What can we expect to see from the US in 2025 in the field of civilian harm, international humanitarian law compliance? What are the main challenges going to be?
Well, here we go. So thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and speak on this. And like many people sort of I'm still trying to catch up with everything that happened yesterday, although surprisingly, not much of it was unexpected. So there's, on the one hand, when I was thinking about that, there's much to say about the sort of solidifying tech oligarchy, the kleptocracy and electoral autocracy, all of which are going to affect these questions around funders, donations, engagement, risk tolerance. That's obviously huge. So we have that on the one hand. We also have the sheer lack of qualifications of Trump's nominees in important positions, and combined with this concerted effort to politicize the civil service, who in the past, in his previous administration, had managed to block, slow, or sidebar some of his initiatives. So there's a lot to say in that regard. And at the same time, there's so little to say because it feels unrelentingly grim. And this was all full display yesterday during the inauguration and the swift promulgation of over 100 executive orders, with more to come. So what I want to do today is we'll talk eventually about the civilian harm mitigation plan, but I want to now put it in a little bit of context. So understanding, addressing, or moderating civilian harm is not going to be a concern for Trump if he pays attention to it at all. This is the same Trump who introduced himself on multiple times to domestic audiences by declaiming, "I am your retribution." And he just pardoned those who stormed the Capitol to try and overthrow the election. He thrills to that kind of unrestrained form of violence. And like the myriad of his mouthpieces, believes that leadership requires and allows killing people at will. Less personalistically, his administration is primarily concerned with increasing what he and his nominee, his ostensible, more than presumptive nominee at this point, for Defense Secretary Peter Hegseth, refer to as lethality, and achieving peace through strength, which is more or less rebuilding national party that what passes for the GOP now claims to have weakened irrevocably under Democratic presidents. And interestingly, this phrase was picked up yesterday by the president of Ukraine in his response to Trump's inauguration. So what is lethality? At the very least, lethality is the capacity for violence unfettered by law. It is to be put in the service of peace through strength that puts America first. So I think it's important we think about lethality, peace through strength, and America first conceptually and really precisely as we think about what might be coming. So peace through strength is a warrior ethos of what I would describe as an unfettered heteropatriarchal masculinity achieved by and achievable only by white straight men with unrestricted access to do what they must. So no woke DEI. And that was one of the executive orders, right? Was to get rid of DEI or any understanding of what he calls the social justice project that has been taking place and implemented across all federal agencies. the presumptive defensive nominee, wrote a book, which I've read, so you don't have to, which is called The War on Warriors: Behind the Betrayal of the Men Who Kept Us Free. So worrying about civilians, civilian harm, humanitarianism, or anything else is not a priority, because it then weakens the cause of the United States as well as the individuals who helm it. So one very practical example, of course, is if you look back to the first Trump administration, is essentially the escalation of drone strikes, the expansion of drone strikes in Yemen and Afghanistan, the decrease of public transparency about it, which led to, various individuals, Brown Institute on the Cost of War or air wars, right, increased deaths. In the latter case of Afghanistan, they believe something like 330%. So we have examples of what that means practically. And it is this notion of lethality that Hegseth referred to in his confirmation as defense secretary. He vowed to bring the warrior culture back to the Department of Defense. A Trump nation will join other nations which outright reject international humanitarian law or embrace international humanitarian law violations and their corresponding war crimes as a tactic. Trump declaimed in 2019, quote, "We train our boys to be killing machines, then prosecute them when they kill," while he pardoned 3 soldiers for war crimes, including the killing of unarmed civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was Hegseth who lobbied hard for these kinds of pardons, saying at the time, "They're not war criminals, they're warriors." And when asked in his hearing what a judge advocate general was, Hegseth demurred, did not want to answer. And then he said, well, someone who would put their own priorities, judge advocate general is the legal officer in the United States military, someone who put their own priorities, their promotion and medals above that of, quote again, war fighters. When he was asked to uphold laws incorporating the Geneva Conventions, Hegseth responded, "We don't need burdensome rules. We fight enemies that play by no rules. We don't need burdensome rules of engagement that make it impossible for us to win wars." So what is then this idea of peace through strength, the exercise of lethality? It's all sort of consolidated, which is now, again, if you look at the United States websites, this idea of America first. I will now put America first in all ways and American citizens first. So the history of that phrase is from the 1940s, when security was essentially understood as certain individuals believed security to be a form of isolationism. Quickly connected with other ideas that were also on the rise, Ku Klux Klan, linked to the anti-immigration movement, sympathizers of fascism, xenophobia, and the like. And the US historian Sarah Churchill describes it as explicitly nativist, white nationalist slogan. Now, under Trump the first time, and again, we saw this in display yesterday, like none of this is like crystal ball at all. You saw it in the inauguration. America First was exemplified by a withdrawal from international agreements. We see that again, Paris Agreement, World Health Organization, cuts to UN funding by almost a third. This was the first administration, but also importantly, the promulgation of these new rights. So for example, the Commission on Unalienable Rights, which was under Mike Pompeo, which was Trump's second Secretary of State, was attempting to create a hierarchy of human rights that essentially prioritized religious liberty and private property. So we can talk about, again, the way that might take place internationally with private property or a view of religion that is not really emancipatory or in many ways ethical, or which was definitely going to come back into play very strongly because it's promulgated by the Heritage Foundation, which was also the author of the Project 2025 playbook, which is, or one of the many authors, sorry, which is the idea of a natural family and advocates for the defense of sovereignty in the name of the unborn. So that we have to think about how that comes into play and the way in which then the identification of 2 genders, right? That means that no federal funding will go to any organization that in any way believes or tries to respond to any questions of gender equity, reproductive and sexual rights, in any sense looks at what they call sort of this social engineering, which you can imagine how that's going to affect across all sorts of NGOs and actors, particularly in the humanitarian sphere, just as we start talking about gender expression, just as we start talking about transgender, just as we start expanding and differentiating among these kinds of very important questions of harm, who is harmed and how we are responding to them. So what's also important about this is when Trump was in power last time and he proposed many of these cuts, he essentially had Congress and a civil service that was protected that could push back both on budgetary reasons and in individual capacity. When you read about the Schedule F reforms, which Trump put into place yesterday, that politicizes, right, not only these appointees, but also it's an attempt to move all of the majority of the budgetary decisions under this idea of a unified executive. In that idea, you can go back to John Yoo and think about, right? This idea that everything resides in the executive will, essentially, and so forth, right? So it's all linked. This lethality, this America first, this peace through strength is linked to an anti-gender ideology. And that was, again, very on clear display. Corresponding attempts to outlaw abortion, gendered rights, equities, traffics and transphobia, and religious essentialism. And the white Christian nationalism is really highly significant, and begin to think about not quite in the ways that we might want to, but nevertheless is deeply affecting the way in which we think about international humanitarian law, the way we think about harm, and so on and so forth. So America First, as I said before, and I'll say again, relies on and animates a specific form of toxic masculinity that one of the last remaining valid New York Times commentators, this is all being filmed, right, and recorded, this is great, valorizes masculinity as misogyny, dominance, exploitation, and aggression. So I am your retribution, Trump says. But no less threateningly, Trump also states repeatedly in regards to women, I'm going to protect them. Well, I'm going to do it whether women like it or not. I'm going to protect them. I'm going to protect them from migrants. I'm going to protect them from foreign countries that want to hit us with missiles and lots of other things. So this isn't even really a veiled threat. This is the old scale protection racket state, right? And this is now the protection racket president. And it's being articulated by a president who is a convicted felon, is a rapist for all intents and purposes, who put forward a nominee who also has multiple credible allegations of sexual assault, who has white nationalist tattoos, and essentially a nominee, that's Peter Hegseth, who believes he's been saved by God. He says, I'm not a perfect person, but redemption is real, and God forged me in ways that I know I'm prepared. So this evangelicals or white Christian nationalism, these veiled threats, this anti-gender ideology are coming together very, not coherently on the one hand, but also on the other hand, coherently. It's kind of this weird, chaotic authoritarianism, as Wendy Brown calls it, that seems like it's everything and anything, but nevertheless, it's got these same sort of foci, right? Yeah, we're going to be really fast. So blah, blah, blah. So what do we identify as potentially salvageable? Here's my point.
I feel like I'm inflicting harm on Helen.
No, that's okay.
This question.
If I turn any redder, I'm going to explode. So it's fine. So we talked about the civilian harm mitigation and response plan, right? And obviously that was institutionalized under Secretary of Defense Austin. Many people in this room know this better than I do and participated in it. It's got 166 staff. It has a budget and so on and so forth, right? It was in some way instituted to protect it from presidential churn. And at the same time, I think it's really important to look at what's happened with Israel, Gaza, with the distribution of anti-personnel mines to Ukraine, and the multiple other ways in which it's been diminished and weakened, as well as the congressional and other threats to the ICC. So fundamentally, we have a plan that's already been weakened, and it wasn't weakened under Trump per se, it was weakened under Biden, and we still have threats of sanctions of the International Criminal Court. So essentially, I'll end there.
Okay. Amazing, thanks. So we've got so many issues on the table. And I think probably we've got quite a number of questions. So we've probably got some on the audience. I think we have quite a lot of people online, but let me first take a question from the room, and then we'll move to a question online. I'm looking at my watch. We have 15 minutes. So let's see, maybe we could gather a few questions. How about we gather like 3 questions, even perhaps 4 questions. So we'll take 2 from the room, 2 online. Let's do that.
I'll try and be fast. To Shelley, interesting observations about especially the role of UN and peacekeepers in the different contexts, and in a sense the void that might be left behind. My question is really more about somehow where, again, UN peacekeepers and these operations have been sources of harm and need in those different contexts, and how, in a sense, them moving away is not entirely a bad thing. So how do we actually interrogate the question, especially about accountability for a lot of the harm and needs that they cause in the different contexts? To the other question around kind of links, I think, Andrew and Emilio, is the interesting question about, moving beyond, in a sense, just religion and culture, but moving towards how, again, religion influences culture and culture influences religion. And of course, coming from an African context where these are 2 different paradigms, and how, in a sense, the way culture influences religion will look different in different contexts. And so you'll talk about Christian practices in different communities looking very different because of the kind of the cultural influences. So how does this also factor into how we understand these different people groupings and how they interact with harm and need and the perspectives in which they see it in terms of these intersecting paradigms? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joshua. If we could take one question online now, if you could read one out. Oh, okay, we'll do one more in the room. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter which order they're said. So perhaps if you give the microphone to somebody in the room. Anyone's hand up? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Really interesting. I think Shelley mentioned security sector reform and the need to increase security sector reform. The EU was revisiting and reviewing the framework, and some of the actors in the EU were saying, does that framework works? The security sector reform, does it work in general? And I don't know if you can speak a bit about it. And also you mentioned the profit of instability. And I think Jamal also mentioned, obviously the last panelist too. So can you, all of you, tell me a bit more of how can we make stability more strategic and profitable? Because some of the things that, the challenges we face is that we are not on common ground, the whole world, so.
We also have questions online, and I'm going to pick one or two.
I think we can do two.
Okay, two. So the first question is about the reluctance of humanitarian organizations to get a little bit messy. That's a quote from Andrew. Where does this reluctance come from? Is it perceived or is it real? And what would be the consequences to doing so, to actually get messy, I think? And the second question focuses on South Sudan, and given the evolving nature of the armed conflict in South Sudan, how do you see the current IHL framework adapting to address growing complexities in conflict in 2025?
Great. Where should we start? Shelley, can we start? Should we start with you?
I provoked a lot of questions. So maybe I'm just going to start the point that Joshua raised about the UN peacekeeping. Completely agree with you. Those two peacekeeping missions have had a lot of challenges. I would say the DRC throughout the history of it, there's lots of examples of where it's been underprepared, insufficient, troops not working cohesively. Some, in my personal experience, in interacting with some troop contributing countries as well, believing that their role as peacekeepers is to protect themselves, not the communities that they're in. And this issue of not being prepared for interacting with children really comes about very clearly because not knowing when something is really a threat versus how to de-escalate situations. So I totally agree with you on that. And then it also results in a question about the amount of money that these missions cost versus could that money be better spent on things like improving domestic frameworks like security sector reform or healthcare or education, etc. So I agree with you that that's true. The challenge that we have right now, though, is that if you've had peacekeeping missions that have been there for 20 plus years and they have become also part of the fabric of what people are expect to see in some communities in which there is no other framework that they may use. And when I say that, I'm not saying that they're effective at what they do, but there is an economy that's also created by them being there, right? And I think that there's a concern of how are we going to deal with that vacuum in those spaces. That doesn't mean we can't do it, but we have to be more creative in that. And the transition solutions, I can tell you from what I've seen, are not there. So I think that that's that's one area. That does not mean to me that I'm saying that those peacekeeping missions should stay there. I'm just saying that I think we have to have a better planning process for what it looks like in that gap for providing security and accountability. And I would also say that certainly, I just want to quickly touch on the SSR question, is that, yeah, I think that the framework needs to be revisited, absolutely. But part of it is, as I've said, though, that I don't think that necessarily those who are charged with overseeing the SSR are the ones who should be overseeing the SSR. So the EU is one example, but the Americans are involved in so many of these SSR processes, yet have no regard for many of the things that, you know, Helen has mentioned on IHL. And as someone who focuses on child protection issues, you know, the country who hasn't endorsed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or many of the other protection mechanisms, and yet we're putting them in charge of doing most of the training at a bilateral level with these countries because of the power and influence that they have. So I think we have to think about that, who's conducting that and who's doing those kinds of issues. And then in terms of the framework, like a rethinking a bit about like how we hold accountability and on important issues related to things such as protection of civilians, right? And I don't want to go too much into the other, I want to allow other people space to talk, but can I just respond to one thing, which I think is really important that Gemma was talking about as well? And I know it's referencing the messy spaces issue that was brought up here, but I want to just quickly say that as an organization where we work at a national level with a lot of military and police on trying to improve their interactions with children, there are messy contexts that we have to be in some actors that we collaborate with. And we oftentimes will be held out to dry for being critiqued for working with those entities. And I've always said, you don't make change by working with those who are already convinced, right? And yet the donor community doesn't understand. You then will get media who will put it out there that you're collaborating with these evildoers, etc. And so a little bit more of an education and understanding amongst the donor community, as well as like a support for like that these innovative processes are needed when what we're trying to achieve is improving things like protecting civilians and children as examples. Okay.
Thank you, Shelley. Andrew.
Yeah, no, just on the first question regarding, you know, the different interpretations of religion, whether it be the, you know, Christianity in Africa and stuff like that. I mean, I think this is a common theme when engaging with religious circles. Obviously, you know, there is no monolith, there is no consensus. But for me, that's part of the beauty of it, really. You know, we can present IHL this particular framework and you know, put it up against these different religious systems, yeah, and within any particular religion, whether it be it Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, there are many different streams, you know, there are many different interpretations, and for me, you know, it's what that stimulates. So for me, I mean, I think so often, you know, in the early days when we were doing these religious circles engagement, you know, as often we can't engage with them because they don't agree with this. They don't agree with that. This misses the point entirely. This disagreement is the fuel for the dialogue. If you're preparing a conference with religious leaders and stuff, the last thing you want is for everyone to agree. It'll be really boring. You'll achieve nothing, you know. So when you can bring people, I mean, I think the essence of this is you need to bring people together in the same room, you know. I mean, in Pakistan, we brought together Shia and you know, Salafi scholars and, you know, Deobandi scholars all together. And, you know, there's enough, this is why IHL is such a powerful tool, because it's a sort of a baseline. It's a, you know, there's a lot of commonality there, which everyone can embrace. It's a different matter, of course, when you're dealing with some human rights laws, because then you get into gender issues that can be tricky. But if you're working with IHL, you don't, you know, you have a vehicle to bring people together and to find some sort of commonality. And not everyone has to agree on everything. And, you know, we've had sessions where, you know, we're in the first meetings, we're being accused of being crusaders or whatever. But, you know, the next week, these same religious leaders will be our strongest supporters. And the important thing is how you do it. I mean, you know, this idea, a lot of people have this idea that we have a networking target. You know, this professionalization that's going on now in the UN. We have a networking target which we have to achieve. We have to, you know, basically to use these people to fulfill our goals. But that's not going to work. You know, you have to learn. It has to be a two-way debate. You have to, you know, make friends. Yeah, and then you can achieve things. You can gain trust and you can build. And so whether then you disagree about this or that particular point is less important than bringing people together and finding a space where people can begin to change their minds or begin to. And I think it's so rarely done. I mean, I've worked for many years in the humanitarian sector. So rarely that you see people from different sectors, you know, lawyers, religious leaders, military people, all together in the same room. You know, and when that happens, you know, the people who thought they knew everything within their sector, you know, suddenly they're asked questions that they wouldn't otherwise be asked. And it's the same with religious leaders and stuff like that. So this is, for me, debate is the goal. You know, we're not looking to impose anything on ourselves. Debate is the goal. If you got, then things develop. So on the messy thing, sorry to go on a bit. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, why are people reluctant to get messy sometimes? I mean, sometimes it's, you know, to do with, you know, in some organizations, you know, ideas of neutrality. You know, it's the idea is, you know, to be neutral, you have to be aloof. You know, whereas impartiality, you know, there's more of a idea that you can engage, you know, but neutrality sort of encourages this aloofness, this reluctance to engage with people who are not parties to armed conflict, reluctance to engage with the context. And there's been this idea that if you know something about the context, you can't be neutral. Quite the opposite is the case. You know, if you don't know anything about the context and there's a high turnover of staff, then you're more subject to prejudice and misinformation, you know. So this is, I think, it comes back to context again, you know, knowledge of the context, because without that, it doesn't matter, you know, you can't really achieve anything. And obviously then there's someone who doesn't know the context. They don't want to take risks because they don't feel, they can't see the opportunities. They don't know enough about the culture or the religion. I'll shut up now, but a lot of it's got something to do with that. I mean, I could go on, but a lot of it is, you know, the bureaucracy as well. You know, people just want to, you know, they don't want to rock the boat.
Thanks. I'm assuming that Gemma might want to add to that, but before I move to Gemma, Emiliana, did you want to?
Just very, very brief, just to add something to what Andrew was saying. I don't think that the indigenous population of Colombia would find that the concept of religion as a driver of culture or culture as driver of religion makes real sense. In the sense that, I mean, these are also Western theoretical constructions. So I think in that case, their spirituality has to do with a way of living, in the sense that you do not require a sort of official nomination as a religion in order for them to experience this sort of cosmovision. And concerning stability, I think it's a very interesting term to think of in Colombia. Of course, the armed conflict has produced a lot of instability, but there's also what I would call among politicians in Colombia sort of rhetoric of stability. Stability is kind of overestimated as a value, but no one knows what stability really means and how to get there. Yeah. So basically, politicians talk about total peace, yes, but how do we get there? And so there's kind of a void sometimes message. And where we should expect stability from the judiciary, which is, of course, the organ of the state that should provide stability through the application of law, then we find this sort of ambiguous reaction towards the acceptance of difference. And I think that then you have the problem of trying through creating a new reality to provide satisfaction to everyone, but sometimes you fall a little short. That's maybe what I think. But thank you for that point.
So we're really nearly out of time, but seeing as Gemma's assumingly not going to chuck us out of her own building, I'm going to let Gemma see if she'd like to also add. You don't have to, but perhaps you want to.
I'll say just very, very quickly on this getting messy
Yeah.
thing. I think completely agree with Andrew on, you've got the bureaucratization of the aid sector, you've got the professionalization of the aid sector, but also there's a complete lack of incentives because actually the whole sector is built around pre-designed results, outputs, very, very often not outcomes, and doesn't accept that there can be or isn't designed or incentivized that actually, as you said, following a process, when it's something like dialogue and putting a bunch of people around a table, you don't know necessarily what the outcome is going to be, and nor can you actually say, we can achieve this. You can say we'd quite like to get towards it, or we'd try to sort of build some greater understanding. So the entire sector, the political economy of the aid sector, is not incentivizing accepting the messy reality, and then everything is on this sort of preconceived notions of success, which really is that sort of result output bit. So I think unless there's sort of much more nuanced partnership approaches between, and honesty and real honesty and humility with organizations, individuals, institutions, to say, you know what, this is really messy, it's unpredictable. As I said, are we designed as a sector to really work with unpredictable actors, actions, the bad guys, we lack so much nuance in the humanitarian sector. So there really has to be a push towards, yes, those contextualized approaches, but also partnership approaches between the different set of actors, total humility, and a bit of acceptance that you might not get to where you want to go. But then to do that, you've really got to start unpicking some of these big structural, systemic, cultural barriers within the sector and the political economy of the sector itself. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll finish there.
Thanks so much. Helen, I feel, no. Okay.
Question for Helen. Oh, no, you can, no, I'll ask that question. I just think I didn't want to.
She didn't want to add an answer to those
I want
questions.
my own question.
But she wants her own question. You're going to get your own question.
Am I allowed to ask a question? It's an observation question. So the panel has said in different forms and shapes that IHL is highly challenged in Western cultures, but you also showed that IHL, in non-Western cultures. But I think what you showed, really, all of you, but you especially, Helen, is how immensely challenged it is within Western cultures and why. Can you just summarize the processes? Like, give us buzzwords, horrible buzzwords.
To help me understand that, okay, I'll take it back. I'll answer the other question.
For the reason we see that these challenges, so you would assume IHL is Judeo-Christian origins and so on, so you shouldn't have theoretically this challenge within Western cultures. But what you describe is probably the most profound challenges to IHL that we will see for generations in the US. Why?
Wow. I think I would answer that in a couple of different ways and probably spend the rest of the night thinking about how I should have answered it. But one of the things that I think is highly significant is that the idea of IHL as what people have been calling, what I think is true, is sort of this political vernacular that we're now using that allows us to talk about horrific atrocities and violations in some way sort of denuded from political context. It has proved very useful and strategically useful. I mean, I think there's an important part about strategic essentialism that we can't lose track of. I also think it's highly variable. I don't think that you would have the sense from all actors, absolutely not all actors, particularly in the US, that international humanitarian law is corrupt or unnecessary or any of those roles. You wouldn't have this huge push on the part of the Secretary of Defense. I think what it shows, again, is this political use to which international humanitarian law is put, which the origins of it in a sort of venerable religion or a sort of institutionalized understanding of a collectivity doesn't save it from. So the interpretive dimensions of international humanitarian law, which we always struggle with, are precisely on display. And we can also talk about it in other particular ways, but I think philosophically, that's how I would answer it.
Okay. I'm going to wind I'm going to wind up because I'm very good at timekeeping, and it makes me very anxious when I run over, especially when I'm chairing. So I'm going to wind up. But we've got so much food for thought here. I've written, I can't possibly summarize it. I'm not even going to try, but I've written down kind of key words that I want to repeat because I thought that they kind of summarize things that I'll take away. So I want to repeat the one that Joanna started with, because I think it's really important just to keep banging on, which is beyond the law, but not without the law. I'm just going to repeat that just in case anyone thinks we're throwing it out the window. We're not. What we're doing is reaching for a fuller toolbox. I also think it was so clear that context matters. And Gemma, you talked also about hyperlocality mattering in some instances, which I think is really important. I also really thought it was very important that we talked about embracing messiness, and messiness may be about dynamics, conflict dynamics, relationships between civilian communities and armed actors. It might also be messiness of identification, even on an IHL front, who's a fighter. But it might also be messiness, conceptual messiness. And so there again, I took away this notion, which I thought was brilliant. You don't make change by talking to people who are already convinced. So this need to have the hard conversations. I think if we're going to go anywhere in 2025, we can't sweep things under the rugs and hope people haven't noticed. We need to have the hard conversations if we're wanting to achieve change. So that's what I'm taking away. I think probably I'm taking away a ton more that's going to come to me. I want to really say thank you to our amazing panel here, who are also members of our advisory board, and thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for all the food for thought you've given us tonight. I think we can put our hands together and say thank you. And I want to end by asking those of you who are online, those of you in the room who haven't yet checked out our blog symposium, which has been running on the Armed Groups of International Law blog and the Articles of War blog, to check those out, because we do have posts on some of the issues that have been discussed. And then very selfishly, I'll also make a plug for our podcast, which is called Beyond Compliance and Conversation, where we're also discussing in interdisciplinary manner some of the issues discussed. So that's it for me. Thank you so much to all of you in the room and those of you online for coming tonight. We're really appreciate that you're giving us your Tuesday evening. Thanks.